If the early church were launched today, it probably, almost certainly would not go viral. There wouldn't be a beautiful highlight reel. There wouldn't be a pastor with 700,000 followers explaining Greek words while sipping boutique coffee. There wouldn't be a worship team releasing an EP every quarter. What there would be is a group of people sitting in someone's living room, passing bread, crying about something they didn't expect to feel, and figuring out how to help someone make rent that month. It would look quiet and unimpressive, probably even a little weird. But that's the kind of thing that changes lives, and always has. We've been in this series called Unreasonable Church, looking at how the earliest Jesus followers lived and how their ways of being might still make sense for us today, even if some of them don't make sense on paper. And if you've been around the last few weeks, we've covered some pretty foundational stuff. The church was never supposed to be a brand. It was supposed to be a movement. It wasn't a performance, it was a practice. It wasn't exclusive, it was shockingly inclusive. It wasn't trying to mirror the empire around it, it was trying to interrupt it. And last week we said it wasn't about fundraising, it was about forming a community that lives open-handedly. And this week we're going to talk about something else that the early church didn't build itself around, that being the stage. They didn't have one. What they had was something much more difficult, something much deeper, much more unreasonable. They had shared suffering. That was a completely foreign idea to the dominant culture. In Roman culture, religious practice was a public, grand, theatrical thing. Temples were enormous, rituals were theatrical and elitist and superficial. Juvenal, a Roman satirist who mocked the emptiness of Roman religion and elite behavior, once wrote, "It's better to have no gods at all than to worship them the Roman way, with blood and bribes and show." Roman religious practice was all about status and spectacle and getting what you want. Pliny the Elder once wrote that people didn't honor the gods out of love, but because it was useful. Worship was about securing favors and preserving status and maintaining order, which, unfortunately, I think you could say about a lot of Christian worship in our day. But the earliest Christians weren't trying to impress anyone, God or human. They were trying to express their gratitude to God while carrying each other through pain. Against the backdrop of the empty, showy Roman religious practice, Paul writes this in Romans 12. "Love from the center of who you are. Don't fake it. Run for dear life from evil. Hold on for dear life to good. Be good friends who love deeply. Practice playing second fiddle. Don't burn out. Keep yourselves fueled and aflame. Be alert servants of the master, cheerfully expectant. Don't quit in hard times. Pray all the harder. Help needy Christians. Be inventive in hospitality. Bless your enemies. No cursing under your breath. Laugh with your happy friends when they're happy. Share tears when they're down. Get along with each other. Don't be stuck up. Make friends with nobodies. Don't be the great somebody." There's no mention of a stage in there. No talk of production value or impressive preaching. It's all relationship. It's all proximity and presence with one another. If you heard what Paul lists there, he says, hold on, show up, share tears, bless enemies, help others. These aren't beliefs, they're actions. Embodied, relational, gritty actions. He's not describing a program, he's describing a relational posture, a way of being together. The earliest Christians didn't gather to consume a product. They gathered to carry each other through pain. Paul doesn't say, love enthusiastically, he says, love from the center of who you are, and don't fake it. He doesn't say, throw a great event, he says, share tears. Don't quit, show up for each other. That's the kind of thing that built the church, not hype or perfect leaders or emotional fireworks, but the slow, honest, painful, and beautiful practice of showing up for each other in suffering. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing inherently bad about good music or well-prepared talks or gathering in a beautiful space. I feel a deep conviction that excellence should be a deeply held value of the church in all its expressions because I think excellence points us towards love for one another and God. But that's not the point here. The point is those things aren't what built the church, and they're not what sustain it either. What sustains the church is the quiet and stubborn decision to keep loving each other even when things fall apart. Now, I know, like so many of the other things we've talked about in this series, suffering isn't exactly a great market strategy, right? No church is putting suffering on their homepage. Actually, yeah, I guess it is on ours. One of the first things you see in our mission, if you go to our website, is our mission to incite love, reduce suffering, and increase joy. But that's because if we want to take Jesus seriously, the way that the early church took Jesus seriously, we have to take suffering seriously. In 2 Corinthians 1, Paul says this, "All praise to the God and Father of our Master, Jesus the Messiah, Father of all mercy, God of all healing counsel. He comes alongside us when we go through hard times, and before you know it, he brings us alongside someone else who's going through hard times, so that we can be there for that person just as God was there for us." That might be the simplest description of the church that you'll find. God comes alongside us so we can come alongside each other. That's it. That's the movement. That's the church. Not when the lights are just right, not when the set list is flawless, but when someone's marriage is falling apart and people show up with a meal. When someone is spiraling in anxiety and a friend texts them, "I'm coming over to talk." This is the stuff that doesn't get applause, but it's the stuff that gets remembered. I want you to do something just real quick. If you've ever been comforted by someone in a really hard season, someone who just showed up for you without trying to fix it, take a second and just bring them to mind. Just their face, their name. Remember what that felt like. That was God's comfort showing up through that person. And maybe you've also been that person for someone else. The world teaches us that strength means independence, toughness, and holding it all together. In most environments, pain is something that you're expected to keep quiet about, right? Especially at work. So we sanitize it, we filter it, we push through. But Paul doesn't say God helps you get over it. He doesn't call God the fixer of all situations or defender of the emotionally strong. Instead, he says God of all healing counsel, which means comfort is not about fixing. It's about presence that heals. God's healing often comes through companionship with others, not just solutions. Paul goes on to say God shows up in it, your suffering, and then sends you to do the same. Strength isn't suffering in silence alone. Instead, it looks like needing help and giving help. Not once, but over and over again. It's a secular thing. It's not linear. You're comforted in your suffering in part so that you can comfort others in their suffering. And the cycle keeps going. I think of a couple around TNL years ago who went through one of the most heart-wrenching and confusing tragedies. They had a miscarriage. And for months, people brought meals, they sat quietly, they texted reminders that they're loved. And 2 years later, when someone else in our community experienced the same thing, guess who showed up first? They did. They knew exactly what to say, and maybe more importantly, what not to say. That's the full circle of comfort that Paul's talking about here. Comfort in the kingdom of God doesn't stop with feeling better. It turns outward. God's comfort leads to meal deliveries, to car rides, to counseling, to someone saying, "I've been there, so let's walk this together." The church is meant to be a conduit for that kind of comfort. Here's the thing, the moments in your life that form you more and more into the person that Jesus was usually doesn't happen in a sanitized, curated environment where we're in control, right? They don't happen when we're performing for others on literal or metaphorical stages. They happen in hospital rooms. They happen on long drives after hard news. They happen in counselors' offices and AA meetings and texts at 1 a.m. We don't grow when life is neat and impressive. We grow when life gets messy, and we don't face it alone. That's what made the early church so weird. They didn't bail when things got hard. They stayed. They showed up for each other through persecution and poverty and betrayal and confusion and grief. They didn't treat suffering as failure. They treated it as formation. And that, honestly, is one of the most powerful things that the church still has to offer. So why then do we resist this? Why does shared suffering feel so difficult, so unnatural, even in church? Maybe it's because we've been trained to see pain as a personal project, something you're supposed to go off and fix alone, then come back when you're okay. And many of us have internalized that. Even here, we show up here and we feel like if I'm struggling, I'm a burden. I'm too much. Or maybe on the flip side, you're afraid of someone else's pain. You're not sure what to say or how to help. So you keep your distance. You tell yourself, I don't want to make it worse, or I don't want this to become my obligation. But listen, it's not your job or my job to fix anyone. It's your job to be with them, to sit in it and say, you don't have to go through this alone. That might be the most Christ-like thing you can do this week. Not solving someone's problem, but refusing to look away from their pain. Or on the flip side, maybe it's being vulnerable with your own pain. In a lot of workplaces, pain is treated like a liability, like it messes with productivity, because that's the most important thing. So we keep our heads down, we hide it. But what if your willingness to be vulnerable is the thing that gives someone else permission to be honest too? Let's zoom out for a second. If anyone had the right to skip out on suffering, it was Jesus. Son of God, cosmic authority, dude literally walked on water. He could have opted for the scenic route, but instead he chose to feel everything. As we read in Philippians 2 a few weeks ago, he didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Instead, he made himself nothing. He didn't bypass pain or sorrow. He walked into it, chose it. He wept, he got angry, he felt abandonment, he bled. And here's what that means. One of the clearest ways to follow Jesus is to enter into someone else's suffering with them. Not when you nail a theological argument, not when you present a perfectly held together, capable version of yourself, but when you love someone in their darkest moments. When you hold their hand and don't rush to fix it. That's where resurrection begins, not with spectacle, but with solidarity. So let's make this a little more concrete. What does shared suffering look like in your actual week? If you're in a relationship, maybe it's intentionally taking time to check in and see how your significant other is really doing. Sometimes life gets so busy and so chaotic and so hectic, you don't even know what the person closest to you is going through. Take time to find out. If you're a parent, maybe it's not waiting for your kid to come to you when they're upset, but asking them, what, if anything, is hurting you right now? If you work in difficult situations like law enforcement or at prisons or anything like that, maybe it's slowing down enough to look someone in the eye, even when they're being abusive towards you. If you're in an office, maybe it's noticing when someone's not okay and asking about it, even if it derails the meeting. If you're caring for aging parents or a chronically ill person that you love, maybe it's remembering that you're not failing. You're just carrying something heavy, and allow someone else to help carry it too. Shared suffering can look like reaching out to the friend that you haven't heard from in a while, beyond just sending memes to them. Dropping off dinner or flowers or a letter, paying for someone's therapy, sitting in silence with someone, letting someone be angry, letting someone be honest, not disappearing when it gets awkward or hard or takes too long. This is what makes church church. Not the hype or the production or the perfection, but the refusal to walk away when things get too real. I think one of the biggest lies that we've absorbed is that church grows when we get better at performing, when we get better at making our lives look squeaky clean and attractive. But the early church didn't grow because of performance. It grew because of its proximity to people's pain. Tertullian was an early Christian writer in the 2nd century who defended the faith during times of persecution. And observing how Christians treated one another in the face of suffering, he famously wrote, It is mainly the deeds of love so noble that lead many to put a brand upon us. See how they love one another, they say, and how they are ready to die for each other. They buried the dead when others ran. They cared for the sick when others stayed away. And I mean literally. I don't know if you knew this, but public hospitals began as a uniquely Christian phenomenon. They simply didn't exist before the church. Medicine was something reserved for the rich and powerful. But in the middle of the 2nd century, just about 100 years after Paul wrote the words that we read tonight, there's this horrible plague that strikes Rome. The rich and powerful, along with their physicians and medicine, all flee the city, hiding safely away from the risk of infection. And they were shocked to see Christians all remain in the city and tend to the sick at great risk and cost to themselves. When everyone else fled to save themselves, Christians stayed to save others. No one had ever done anything like that before. They chose to remain and suffer together, and it changed the course of history. You can argue with a sermon. You can critique a church's branding and movements, but you can't ignore a community that loves like that. So here's the hope, that we would be the kind of church where no one suffers alone, where presence matters more than polish, where honesty is met with grace, where grief doesn't get rushed, where joy doesn't feel fragile, and where the answer to how are you can actually be, I'm not okay. Where we really are a place that incites love and reduces suffering and increases joy. That kind of culture doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we choose to live like Jesus, not on stages, but in kitchens and waiting rooms and on lunch breaks. So in closing, this will never be trendy. There's no cool way to market shared suffering. There's no shortcut to building this kind of community. It's slow, it's messy, it costs you something. But it's also the only thing that will matter in the long run. So, as usual, here are 3 reflection questions for you to think about this week. The first is, where am I tempted to hide my pain instead of sharing it? Where do I feel like I need to stuff it down and just go off and fix it by myself and then come back? The second is, who in my life is going through something hard, and how can I simply show up for them? What's a small act of service to help them feel like they're not alone? And finally, what kind of church are we becoming? And how can I help move us towards shared presence over performance? So take a minute and sit with those. Because if we're doing this right, it won't be shiny, it won't be cool, it definitely won't be easy. But it should look like love. And that is what we were always meant to be. So take a few minutes to sit with these questions quietly and let yourself actually answer them. There's no rush, there's no need to fix anything right now. Just notice what's surfacing. And in a few minutes, we'll observe communion together.